Before we begin, can I ask one small favor? If you like the show and the conversations we're sharing, it would mean the world to me if you could subscribe to the show and follow along on whatever platform you're listening to this on. You may not know it, but by simply subscribing, you are helping us in a big way to continue creating and sharing our quiet conversations. Thank you so much. Now, onwards to the show.
We tend to view endings and therefore restarts as failures. So the work really is about reframing that so that we start to tell ourselves different stories. Well, we know that restarts are much more common today because people are living longer, happier, healthier lives in general, and therefore having more evolutions. So we know that people are having on average 12 jobs. They're also settling down later. Divorce rates are 50%. So that's a lot of restarts for people. Restarting isn't the exception anymore, it's the norm. I think the greatest gift that we can ask ourselves is, am I still on the path that I want to be on? Am I the person that I was 2, 5, 10 years ago? Yeah, it's okay to feel drawn to things and not have it all figured out. Your life crises might just be your opportunity for growth.
This week on The Quiet Life, we're talking about leadership, support, and finding the balance between personal and business success. And so I'm speaking to Sophie Scott, author, founder, and psychotherapist. As a transpersonal integrative psychotherapist, Sophie supports her clients to transform the shadowy stuff into personal growth, tailoring a blend of techniques specific to the individual from behavioral experiments, visualizations, inner child work, mindfulness, and more. Sophie's expertise extends to mentoring and coaching a diverse range of individuals, from students to CEOs, and aiding them in discovering their inner magic. Sophie consults for various startups in the health and wellness space, and at the time of recording this podcast, she's currently writing her first book, You Are Not Alone, which is due out January 2025. Now, onwards to the show. So you're a therapist, or a psychotherapist, or I believe what I read, an integrative therapist. What is a therapist? What is the difference? Because especially even as someone who's aware of these practices or modalities, I tend to find that therapy, psychotherapy, integrative therapy can also be a little bit confusing for some people to understand what is what and what does what.
Sure. So psychotherapy and therapy are the same thing. It's just therapy is shorthand. And integrative is just the type of therapy that I practice, or psychotherapy that I practice. In short, it's a holistic approach. So I was trained in lots of different schools of thought, from sort of the clinical and analytic Freudian school of thought, through to Jung, which involves working with dreams and the idea of there being a kind of collective unconscious to us, through to kind of body breath work, somatic work, because a lot of our trauma and our anxieties get trapped in the body. And then I actually also like to bring in a little bit of kind of coaching style to my work, particularly because a lot of the people that I do work with often come with work issues that they're facing. So integrative therapy means that you work holistically with whoever's in front of you. You don't just apply kind of one lens, but you bring out tools and frameworks that are appropriate for that person.
And how does that differ to traditional therapy or talk therapy? What happens in that environment?
Yeah, so most of the therapy that I do is talking therapy.
Right.
But I think what you're referring to is maybe analysis, which is the Freudian kind of like really old school style of therapy.
Is that the one lying on the sofa,
Exactly.
looking at the ceiling?
Yeah, so it's not as relational as the type that I do. So I sit there with my clients like I'm doing with you now, looking into the whites of each other's eyes and connecting. And actually, it's the relationship that's at the heart of the work. Whereas that one, often the therapist is sitting, not even facing sort of the client's behind, lying down on a sofa. It's more of a kind of stream of consciousness. And also in analysis, someone might come 2-3 times a week, whereas I see clients once a week. And listen, it's different strokes for different folks. my personal feeling is that therapy has moved on, and it's a good thing to also, help people to be self-sufficient and not need to come kind of several times a week. That's just my opinion, that it can kind of breed a codependency, whereas the therapy that I practice is very much about helping you to get to know yourself so that actually you're your own healer, ultimately.
And when you say therapy's moved on, is that perhaps a reflection of something doesn't work or hasn't been working, or just the way in which it's received, or maybe how we are now as a different generation or different society, that there's a different need for it in how it's practiced?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, from my perspective, it's more in terms of how society's moved on. So, again, in that traditional analysis, someone may know nothing about the therapist, about the analyst. They might know nothing about them. And, generally, you don't disclose lots about yourself to your clients, but actually I'm a big believer in meeting them as myself, being authentic. They may know something about me, find me on Instagram, for example. And I might choose at moments, only if it's going to be useful to them, to disclose something about myself if I truly believe it will be beneficial. So I think that just naturally, because of social media, because of the fact that as well, a lot of therapists these days have portfolio careers for lots of reasons, and I'm one of them. I feel like I can bring that to my work rather than being this kind of like faceless, nameless person that's harder to connect with. And then, of course, we're seeing, which I'm not yet practicing, it's a little bit less common right now in the UK still, but we're seeing advancements in terms of using, LSD and, psilocybin and stuff like that in psychotherapy as well. So I think that things are progressing all the time. And maybe there's still a little bit of resistance in the industry to that, but I'm actually somebody that wants to kind of champion progressing therapy and making it as destigmatized, as, accessible to everybody as possible.
That's really interesting. The fact that I'm going to use the word open, or quote unquote, in a relationship with your clients or patients.
I call them clients.
Clients. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting because, even reflecting back now, for disclosure, I'm not currently working with a therapist, but I've worked with therapists before and I know nothing about them. Mm-hmm. You just show up and you have helpful conversations. Mm-hmm. But I do remember there's a few times with the last person I worked with last year, and I took a break just because of family, kids, these kind of things, and whether or not that's the right answer or the best or an excuse of the moment. But it was in her home, but her home was repurposed to have let's call it a therapy room in the house. And not on purpose, but I remember one time saying, is this where you live with your family? And I remember very distinctly, she kind of skirted the question, almost as if she didn't want me to know that she lived there, where it was obviously quite obvious because it was like a big family home in a residential area. And it was like you walk into the front door into the room, which is usually always like just by the front door. Yeah. But, someone would shut a door and you'd see like a sofa and a TV. And I just think it's a really interesting perspective because in some ways, and maybe that was me subconsciously, it kind of creates a level of skepticism. Like, if I know nothing about the person who's helping me, is that not fair is the right word, but does it then not create another variable sometimes for consideration? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it can become part of the work. So, maybe there's a way of saying, it's really interesting, you're curious. I wonder if you're curious about me and who I am, because this is a very unique dynamic. You're opening up and telling me super personal things about yourself, and yet you don't know anything about me. And how does that feel for you? Like, does that make you skeptical? Do you distrust me? And is that a familiar feeling for you? So firstly, sort of digging into but the client's felt experience of what's going on is the important thing, first and foremost. And then opening up that as a conversation. Okay, so how would it be to know something about me? Would you like to ask me something? What would feel important for you to make you feel comfortable and safe? But I think, firstly, the important thing is an exploration rather than just say, yeah, so here's my passport number, here's my address,
yeah,
you know
course,
what I mean? But certainly at points, I have disclosed some things to clients, particularly because I think a lot of depression and mental health issues in general can come from a feeling of isolation, of feeling like we're alone in this. And so if somebody can know that they're not, that I myself might have had an experience, or indeed there is an anonymized story that one can share, I think that that's really beneficial. We learn through stories, right? We learn through human experience.
Because isolation is a big thing, isn't it? It's an aspect of maybe all human behavior that says this is a big concern, right?
Yeah, it is. So you're hitting on one of the main existential concerns that we work with in therapy, but that we all have, right? And those are, so isolation is one of them, the fact that we are born alone and we die alone. However many people you have around you that you love, you know, in essence, you're sort of looking through your own eyes and only you know what you're seeing, right? Another existential concern is meaninglessness. That's like, well, where do I derive meaning from in life? Does life in and of itself have any meaning? Third is death, the fact that we know that we're all going to die, but we don't know when and we don't know how. And then freedom, which is the fact that we have, you know, most of us, especially in the Western world, are lucky enough to be able to have freedom to make decisions. But that comes with a feeling of fear often of making the right decisions. So isolation is not something that we can sort of switch off because it's just part of the inherent human experience. But certainly I think through connection, we can, and connection that feels positive and good, that we seek out for ourselves, we can use it as a function to kind of propel us forward in a positive way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So is that why people end up in therapy, or is that why people seek it out?
Because they feel isolated.
Or any of those things that you just talked about?
I think so, yeah. I mean, they don't consciously come and think, I feel so isolated, I need therapy. I mean, some do. Or, you know, I feel like I've got so much freedom, I don't know which decisions to make. But underneath it all, those are often kind of things that people are grappling with. And therapy can be incredibly helpful for them. I think when it comes to isolation, something that I actually believe in a lot is peer support. So that might be kind of like, you know, group therapy or other support groups. But a big one is meaninglessness, I found personally. People come into therapy because they're grappling with, what is my life about? Where do I derive meaning? And that can come about a lot when somebody is forced to start again, which is, you know, why I think we're talking about what we are today. It's such a huge reason that people come into therapy. They've either had, you know, an enforced ending, or they're starting to feel like something's off and that something needs to change, but they don't necessarily know where to go.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to chat with you today is because I know that a lot of your work and aspects of your personal life or your career created or forced elements of starting over. And I think I always say that, you know, experience is the best form of learning anything. And what does it actually mean when we talk about starting over? Because to start over means start afresh, shift in identity. What is starting over?
Well, obviously it means something different for everybody, but usually starting over involves an ending of sorts. So something, and you know, an enforced ending might have happened. Maybe we've been made redundant, or, our partner has broken up with us, or indeed there can be the death of a loved one. And so suddenly we're forced to start again, in essence, and to imagine, well, what would life be like now? What would this 2.0 version of me, or 3.0, or I've had so many restarts, 1 million point oh version of me be? And so often the first part of that, I think, is helping someone to process an ending, which is akin to grief, really, which isn't a subject matter that is a very popular one to talk about, but I think it's very important. And so therapy can allow space for those feelings, those experiences to be shared in a non-judgmental setting. So you might feel, denial. A lot of people are very much in denial about an ending that's just happened, or there might be a lot of anger there. They might have gone into a depression. So it's offering space to process that. And, processing that can look like lots of different things. Often it's giving somebody an outlet to maybe a creative outlet. It could be that they produce a piece of writing or a piece of art that kind of symbolizes this loss for them and this kind of transitional period that they're in. In therapy, often I do chair work, which is a Gestalt method whereby somebody can have a sort of imaginary interaction with another person, or even actually part of themselves, we do. But the idea is that through that interaction, the circle gets completed somehow. And then sometimes it's just like the passing of time, right? Some things you can't get over. You just learn to process and to live with. So that's the first part, I think.
Do you think it's a universal challenge, or is it a personality type of challenge? When we're, in this instance, forced to change or starting over unintentionally? Is that something that everyone goes through?
I think everybody should go through it, because if you're not starting again, you're not evolving, right? So some people will stay locked in denial forever. And listen, everybody's here and has their own path, but I wouldn't say that is an inspirational path to lead, right? We know that even just on a biological level, the cells in our body, most of them die and are, new cells grow. So we are meant to constantly evolve, and with longer lifespans, we're living longer and healthier lives. There isn't that kind of linear path anymore. I think it is about processing what's been and thinking, okay, well, now what's next for me?
And you've had some experience with that in your life.
Lots of experience, both professionally. My career path has not been linear. I've had 1,001 careers. I started out as an actor, which is probably surprising for some people, and then I moved into kind of script development and the world of production. Working with my sister, we did I had a production company, and then I started to train as a psychotherapist, initially very much as a kind of, I should say as a hobby or as an interest, but I'd been in therapy from a very young age after I experienced the loss of my mother. And it was so profound for me that I thought, you know what, I'm going to really enjoy doing a kind of an evening class in this. And based on everything that I was learning, I had this belief, this idea of like, how amazing would it be if the general public could know about all of this stuff that I'm finding out? How much happier and more fulfilled would people be? And that then prompted my idea for Balance, which Balance magazine, which I ran for 7 years, where I was the editor. And so I launched that sort of really not even halfway through my training as a psychotherapist. And then I was sort of doing both in unison. So yeah, from a career perspective, I've had plenty of restarts, and not just changed jobs, but actually shifted industries. And I don't think that that's so rare these days.
I think you're right, and I think it's really interesting. And actually, I mean, that's where we first met when you were editor of Balance. And I think what's really interesting, it is that thing where I don't know if it's times have moved on, or we're of a certain age, or
young, very young.
Yeah, a young age where we weren't raised with this ideology that we had to have one job for life, or you had to be a doctor, or you had to go do that thing. Mm-hmm. And whether it was freedom or rebelliousness to say, I can choose the path. But I do think there is, and maybe I'm just going through the lens of maybe what I know, is that if you're moderately to successful in what you do, doing something different is harder. Mm-hmm. And arguably the fall from grace is further. Mm-hmm. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. I mean, I gave a talk recently on imposter syndrome, and we know that actually imposter syndrome isn't something that just people at the start of their careers have. Actually, it's people who are higher up, sort of, further on in their careers, they've got further to fall down the career ladder, if that's what you're referring to. So yeah, there's always this fear of like, oh my gosh, what happens if I have to start again? What happens if, and in this day and age of social media, if something bad is said about me, or if I'm cancelled, or, like uber successful people, and indeed celebrities, they go around with this fear, right? And yet, and this is a difficult thing to talk about, but actually, often there can be a hidden gift in starting again. When I look at my own life, I think I was meant to pivot. I think that maybe that part had got me as far as I was going to come, and actually I was outgrowing that experience.
Was there a curse before the gift? Was there a shadow before the light?
Always.
In your path or in your journey?
Yeah. So, for example, with, I remember going back to acting, I started to notice that I was going to castings and I was getting this like weird twitch in my neck and like, and I thought something's off. And I think it was a version of anxiety that I was starting to experience. And by the way, just because you have anxiety, it doesn't mean that something's wrong, right? It's about managing and dealing with that anxiety. But I think that I had, at that point, done a lot of work on myself that I knew that something needed to shift.
In a clinical or in psychotherapeutic perspective, what is anxiety? What are the parameters of it?
Yeah, well, anxiety is an umbrella, but there are lots of anxiety disorders underneath that, according to the DSM-5. Which is a sort of official diagnostic criteria that's used in the US here, but kind of globally, really. So the most common form of anxiety is what we call generalized anxiety disorder. And that is when one has a feeling that at any moment something bad is going to happen. So it's like living in a state of high alarm, even if there isn't a saber-toothed tiger around. So people describe it as feeling like they're living on a cliff edge, and at any point something's going to tip them over, or something bad's going to happen. We know that it can often be linked to kind of earlier sort of traumatic experiences, or something that hasn't been processed, and it's very much a physiological thing. So, from a symptoms perspective, it would include things like a raised heartbeat, finding it difficult to sleep, your breathing is much more shallow, you may lose your appetite, because you're not able to kind of fall into that rest and digest state. You might have migraines, the jitters, this feeling all the time of being on edge. So it's very much a physiological thing. And actually, I often say that before the introspection can happen in therapy, we've got to help the client just bring everything down and help them to reset the nervous system through things like breath work, right?
So if someone comes to you with general anxiety, we'll just call it that because they might not know the terminology around it, is the approach to be present before we go into the past, or is it to go into the past to bring you into the present?
It's a great question, Michael. I don't want to be prescriptive and say it has to be one way or the other.
Sure.
But generally, the real peace is found by going back into the past. But I would always ensure somebody is grounded in the present before doing that, because otherwise you can re-traumatize somebody. So first, you would help to ground them through things like, resonance frequency, breath work, through, visualization, through helping them, discover what it is for them that resets themselves. So whether that's encouraging them to be in nature more, go for walks, to practice some self-care first, because otherwise you're sort of taking someone back to a place where they're not necessarily equipped and ready to deal with it.
Hi friends, I hope you're enjoying listening to the show. One of the ways that we can keep this pod going in the best possible way is by the help of some of our amazing partners and friends. So if you can give me just a few moments to listen into these ads and messages, it would be so appreciated. Exhale is a choice to take control of your mind and mental health. Welcome to the Just Breathe course for breathwork and meditation, our 6-week program to help you breathe better, reduce stress, and regulate the nervous system. Hi, I'm Michael James Wong, meditation and breathwork teacher and founder of Just Breathe. And my life's work is dedicated to helping as many people as possible quiet the mind using the power of breathwork and meditation. And that's why I created Exhale. This course brings together my 20 years of experience studying, sharing, and teaching these practices in the real world. Inside the course, you'll gain instant on-demand access to over 100+ videos, lectures, technique tutorials, and guided breathwork and meditation practices dedicated to helping you create a personal and powerful ability to respond to any and all of life's big and small stressful moments. In this course, you'll learn my unique perspective and agnostic approach to help quiet the mind and regulate the nervous system. Each week during the course, you'll be invited to join our live Zoom sessions where I'll share and discuss with you both the science and the wisdom of these quiet practices. And even more, I'll be joined by some of the world's most well-respected psychologists and neuroscientists to help us understand even further. We'll talk about the nuances of stress, the science of stimulation and how we regulate the nervous system, and how to rewire your brain for the better. And what I love most about this course is you're not just joining me, you're joining a community of like-minded people all around the world who are dedicated to learning more, building their personal practice, and understanding how to use breathwork and meditation to change our lives for the better every single day. As a reminder, you'll get on-demand and lifetime access to the course material. You'll have access to 100+ video lectures, techniques, and practices. And you'll have 6 weeks of live talks and lectures and learnings with me on breathwork and meditation. You'll have 3 amazing talks with some of the world's most well-respected psychologists and neuroscientists. And you'll become part of our global Just Breathe community. So join us on the journey as we take control of our mind and mental health. Welcome to Exhale. The course is now open. See you on the inside. I think you're one of the first people I've talked to, especially on this show, where you express the need to be grounded before you go back in time. And I think very commonly or quickly when I speak to different people within your discipline or practice, that it's very much about what happened when you were younger. What experiences did you have? And is that the integrative approach, or that is maybe the responsible approach?
I would argue it's the responsible approach, but I think you're right. It's probably more common in those who've got integrative training. if the mind is full of anxiety, and we know that anxiety is very much kind of whirring thoughts, right? Speaking simply to the mind is not going to help to eradicate it or lessen it. We've got to start with the body. So, people can have had terribly traumatic experiences, be that, physical abuse, sexual abuse, etc. But even if it's something like a loss or any type of trauma, right, it gets trapped in the body if it's not dealt with at the time. So first, the way in my view, is through the body. And you don't have to be, I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not, I don't have the training that you do in breath work. But I have enough grounding in this to know how to safely take somebody back to the past. You would never, in my opinion, dive into that too quickly with somebody. I think it would be really irresponsible.
So in those first few sessions, which, it's very much probably like, trying to buy a car or trying to find the right match on a dating app. Like, what's the process of finding the right person to work with, the right therapist? How does one do that? And when's the right time?
Yeah, well, that's obviously very personal for everybody. In the UK, generally people go to either UKCP or BACP websites. And I can't stress enough how important this is, because those are the accrediting bodies, and a lot of psychotherapists out there are not properly qualified and accredited. So whatever you do, you should look at therapists that have one, or if not, like me, both of those accreditations under their belt. And then I hear this so much from people. It's like scrolling through hundreds, thousands of profiles with a little picture and, this blurb. And it's exhausting for people, quite frankly, when obviously they're not, necessarily in the best kind of frame of mind anyway. So I'm trying to think about, like opportunities of how that can be streamlined. I certainly think there's more of a need for like video and, seeing something of the person. But then generally, you might find somebody who's in your area if you're looking for in-person psychotherapy, or if remote, doesn't really matter, I suppose. But it's about, who might appeal to me, and then reaching out to them, usually over email or through one of these accrediting bodies. And then, so I can speak about myself, I offer a kind of complimentary 15-minute telephone call, which is really just an opportunity for them to ask any questions and, have a sense of whether they want to book in for a proper 1-hour assessment session. And then that 1 hour is about taking a really thorough history, background, upbringing, physical health, if there's been any kind of suicidal ideation, if the person is on medication or has been on medication. And that's kind of, that 1 hour really gives you a sense of who the person is, what's bringing them to therapy, but also if you're a good fit. And that's so important. And that's, as you said, a bit like dating. So, how long should you give somebody? I would say generally 6 sessions is good. But if after that assessment session, you don't feel like, do you know what, I would actually enjoy working with that person and meeting them on a weekly basis, even if it's just for those 6 sessions, then keep going with your search. But it's a really difficult one, Michael, because there isn't a kind of a perfect way to find somebody.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, that's how I was. I apologize was the wrong term, but I shopped around for a while.
Right.
And it's kind of that thing where it's like if you've had a bad day and you come home, you're like, oh, I want to watch something on TV. But then you're like, okay, well, then there's Netflix, and then there's Amazon Prime, and there's Disney Plus, whatever the millions of there are. And on each of those platforms, there's 1,000,001 choices, but you just feel a bit crap, and so you just want something that will help, you know, whether it's if you're a rom-com versus a drama kind of person or a reality show, you just want something, but you don't have the tools to figure it out, and there's just no clear system for it. I suppose that would be very similar as well. Now, if you were in a big mode of restart, if you were in a phase of starting over, if you were a business person who was literally lost a job or sold a company or something like that, and you're faced with this, and let's just say by luck or by recommendation they find you, like what is that process of actually day one, clean sheet of paper, today I'm no longer that thing? Where do you go from there?
Yeah, well, I think that depending on how they've processed the ending, you may need to do a big piece of work around that or not. But in therapy, we generally think that one ending brings up all other previous endings. So it might be that particular thing was quite small, but actually for some reason it's triggered this huge emotion in them, and that's probably because it's linked back to another much more significant ending from their past.
So you mean like the end of this job triggers also the end of that old relationship?
Correct.
Or getting kicked out of school?
Correct, exactly.
Right.
So you would work with that experience and try and do some healing around it. That might involve, doing some visualization and going back to that time and giving yourself the comfort that you didn't get at the time through that visualization. It might involve kind of writing, processing, doing the chair work that I mentioned before as well. So I think that that's the first bit. And then the second bit is around trying to help somebody, gently guiding them to finding the gift in that situation. And that could be something that they've learned, so a piece of knowledge that they have now. It could be something that empowers them as they move forward, or it could be that they've taken something that they've been inspired by from that, and now they've created something, like, I've created a business from this really difficult thing that I've been through. So you use inspiration to propel you forward. And the idea there is that you've grieved what there is, and of course that's an ongoing process. But now, can we actually reevaluate our lives? Can you reevaluate where you're at? Maybe, is it possible that thing needed to go, or what have you learned from that previous experience that you are now more well-informed so that you can move forward? Like, for example, in a business, people often don't have like product market fit, so it's not working. And really and truly, they should probably start from scratch or like ditch that product. And we're seeing this a lot with like AI tools, because obviously ChatGPT's now come along. And all the work that's been done before to create this AI product is now kind of obsolete. But it's really hard in the case of a founder, for them to say, do you know what, let's just tear up everything that we've already worked on and, all the money and time that we've spent and start something from scratch, because there's something called the sunk cost fallacy. But actually all evidence points to the fact that sometimes it's a lot better to build something up from the foundation rather than just sort of to keep adding things onto something that's already got a shaky foundation. So it's that kind of evaluation process, which also ties into, oh my goodness, I've realized that life isn't perfect, that there are limitations to life. So how can I use the reality of that, which talks to those kind of existential concerns that I mentioned before? How can I lean into those and use them to align my life and my behavior in the way that I want? How can I find more meaning in my life? because I usually say that anxiety comes about when there is a misalignment between our behavior and our values. And so sometimes an ending offers a perfect opportunity to just take stock and to see, okay, moving forwards, how can I get back into greater alignment with myself?
What if the ending is quite vast, right? So let's take like a professional athlete gets an injury and can't run anymore or can't throw a ball anymore. There's a big shift, not just in what they do, but the identity attached to it. And maybe the fame or acclaim that comes with it, or just the celebration of you do that well. How do you support that when it's a big identity shift, not just, I guess, new foundations that need to be set?
It's really challenging. You're reminding me of a story of, Vera Wang, who's the #1 bridal wear designer in the world. And her story is that she started out as a figure skater, and she was very talented, but she didn't make the Olympic team. And so she then went into editorial, and she worked at Vogue for, I think, almost 20 years, for a very long time. And then when she wasn't made editor-in-chief, she resigned. And she was 40 when she got married, and she couldn't find a dress that she wanted, so she designed her own wedding dress, and then that sort of created her new dream, which has ultimately taken her to the very top of her profession. And I think that, obviously she's got bucket loads of resilience. But I suppose the point being is that we're all on a journey and on a path. And so, I don't know, like Vera personally, right? But what I'm gathering is that her identity wasn't so fixed in being a figure skater, but maybe it was more about her connection with her own drive, with what drove her, with her own sense of ambition or wanting to derive great pleasure from being brilliant at what she does, at her craft. So I suppose what I'm saying is that it's far better to build an identity based on who I am and who I want to be, rather than it's just about this, it's just about being at the top of this profession, or it's just about being a mother. The idea is that we are all evolving all the time. And so to help somebody see that actually that was just one chapter of their book, or one section of their book, as opposed to the whole book, in that way, their identity can shift,
But it's a bit like, so exactly in that metaphor of like chapters of a book. Oftentimes when you're flicking through a chapter of a book, it never ends at the end of the page, right? So there's always that gap between when that chapter ends and the next one starts. And for some people that's weeks, months, years. For some people that's the space of depression or feeling terrible about themselves, or the world unraveling for them, or them, quote unquote, going off the deep end, or moving to Bali, whatever it is. What is the way back? What is the work that we do to restart from that place where there's this big gap in what we do, our identity, and the space between maybe when we turn the page?
There's no simple answer to that fantastic question, but I think it comes through a commitment to ourselves and through doing the work. People should take the time that they need to process and to do that grief piece. And I know that there have been times in my life where I've needed a lot longer, and then other times where I've sort of quite quickly picked myself back up again. But what's important that people do know is that your resilience isn't finite. It's something that you actually can increase. And so doing things like practicing mindfulness, through just trying small behavioral experiments, can be a great way to build that sense of confidence in yourself and in your own resilience. So I like to think, and this is where I hope that I'm not like too much like a traditional therapist, is that I don't think the work is just about, you know, sitting behind closed doors and talking. I think it's about engaging with the world. So, you know, I would always encourage people where possible to have a bias to action. And that could be in the smallest, you know, incremental steps. But the existentialists believe, and that's a branch of psychotherapy which I integrate into my work, that we're in a perpetual state of becoming. So in other words, you're not just defined as Michael today, or you weren't born defined as Michael. You become Michael and who you want to become every day, that little bit more, right? And it's not linear. You might go backwards and go forwards, but the point is that it's an ongoing process. And it's through your commitment to discovering more about who you are and engaging with the world, just even in small ways, you start to build that kind of strength up again and learn more about yourself in the process. So, you know, you don't build that resilience sitting and talking about it. You build it through going out into the world and rubbing up against it a little bit.
Yeah, it's a really nice way, especially coming from someone who, you know, is a therapist, who a lot of times the conversations are, let's talk about it. And one of my teachers always says that when things end, we must intentionally grieve. Like you can't shy away from that. You have to say, if it's frustrating, let it be frustrating. If you're angry, be angry. But you must grieve and then choose to move on. Because otherwise we carry it with us and it just becomes part of who you are regardless of what you do.
Yeah, and I think that's beautiful, but I'd like to just kind of expand on that for a second if I can, which is that, you know, there are some things that we actually cannot move on from. There are some things that actually terrible traumas that happen to us, losses, that you're not going to just reach a place where you're better. You know, I lost my mother when I was young, and that is not something that I will ever be able to move on from or get over. But it's in time, I think, about assimilating that experience into who I am. So, you know, it informs who I am and the work that I do. And so nothing will bring back my mother or nothing will make that loss be okay. But I also know that I went to therapy. I was carted off to therapy a week before my mum passed away by my sister, my amazing sister. And I wouldn't be here today or be the person that I am today without having gone through that experience and then having had therapy. And now I'm a therapist and I'm able to talk about it and help other people. So it's not about, yeah, as I said, kind of moving on or it's all okay now. But is there just something that I have found to be meaningful about my experience and that now I can make meaning from in the world?
I know we frame the conversation a lot, or maybe some around starting over if it was a job or an injury and these types of things. But I suppose what I'm learning in real time is that we are restarting all the time with lots of different situations, life experiences. If you're okay to share, what was that restart for you at that time when you lost your mother?
I was 14, so there wasn't really a restart. I think that was an example of when, you know, I was just completely disorientated and not with it, frightened. So I think the restart, I mean, that took me years to restart. I think well into my 20s, so that I could, you know, in a sense, become present again in my body. I think I was just in shock for such a long time. So again, it was only in helping me to process what my experience was in here and now that I was then able to maybe go back and tend to that young part of myself.
In all the experiences you've had in your life and all of your clinical expertise that you've learned, what's the actual action steps? What is maybe we call it the universal principles to restart, like for anyone who's going through anything? What is it that helps?
So I like to call upon design principles. So what design principles are in effect is the thinking that designers use when they're creating a product, right? And I think that if you sort of just zone out for a moment, you can look at those and think about, okay, well, how might they apply to us as people, especially when we're building something from scratch or starting over from scratch? And so the first stage that designers do or use is empathy. So there's a period of self-reflection where they identify and understand, the feelings, and then they are able to define the situation and the problem, right? So, okay, I define the fact that I have lost my job and I now don't know what I want to do. And then the next part is ideation, which is basically brainstorming. And the idea for that is just go wide. Go as wide as you can. Nothing's off limits. The sky is the limit. Come up with lots and lots of ideas. And then based on that ideation, you start to create a prototype, which is by no means a finished product. It's not a finished version. And in real life, that looks like small behavioral experiments. So I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what job I want to do. I don't know how my career is going to go. I've just been made redundant. Okay, so one option is, I'm quite interested actually in this particular industry. So maybe a small behavioral challenge that I can set myself is I'm going to go and talk to 3 people who are in that industry. Or actually, now I come to think of it, I didn't really love the job that I used to be in. I don't want to do it all the time, but maybe I could consult for that company, maybe on a part-time basis. Maybe I should reach out to them and see if they'd be open to that, etc. So it's about creating these kind of small actions, this prototype, so that you can go out, try it, and get feedback. And then based on that feedback, then you iterate. And it's not a linear process. It's kind of a process of refinement and going back and forth. But I think it's really interesting, this idea of kind of like design thinking when it comes to your own life. And there is a really good book on the subject matter, actually, which has been written by 2 Stanford professors, Dave Evans and Bill Burnett, called Designing Your Life. And they run this, or at least they did, I'm sure they still do, as a course at Stanford University. They've run it for maybe a decade now. But yeah, I think it's super interesting when you look through the lens of how a designer would create a product. Well, actually, how can I use that and apply that to my life? In other words, it's not about having it all figured out, right? It's about just trying something and seeing, and then it's through that feedback that you might discover, that was a blind spot. That was something that I didn't foresee. If I'd have jumped the gun and created the finished version as opposed to the prototype too soon, I might have gone down a rabbit hole, right? So I think it's super useful.
I think that's a really nice way to look at it. I think as someone myself who, let's say, have done this work for a long time, but at the same time have had to, from a life, work, business, family point of view, change things, start things, it is easy to jump into something new, to try to get that same identity or feeling or appreciation for your work quickly. Yeah. And I think it's a fascinating thing, an interesting thing to slow things down and to figure out what actually comes next. Mm-hmm. One of the really interesting perspectives that we have in mindfulness practices is the most common question that humans ask themselves is what's next, right?
Interesting.
What's next? Mm-hmm. And while that's maybe not rooted in science or fact, let's say. It is a perspective that we always have this layer of uncertainty, even if we feel a settled nature of who we are or what we do for work or a level of acclaim, whatever it is. And having a process or a step-by-step plan of attack, I think is really insightful and helpful. And it's really, I think, I suppose, a testament not just to the practices of what therapy is, but what I really appreciate is the integrative approach you take to say, let's look at this as real people working in a relationship between therapist and client, because it's like anything, working together is usually a process of growth than just someone telling you what to do.
Well, exactly. And it's a bit like this interview, for example, or any interview. It's like, okay, how much can you prepare? Well, you can have up your sleeve things you might like to say, but actually the creation is between you and I, and it can only come about. I can't just sit in a room and practice and learn a script off by heart, because what if you ask me completely different questions? And that's the same, that's true of everything in life. It's only through, as I say, kind of rubbing up against the world or having an interplay with somebody else that you can actually learn and do something. And it takes, it shouldn't be a solely introspective experience. It should be about what we're going to create together.
If people listening to this podcast remember nothing of the whole conversation, but you want them to take away one thing, what would it be?
Your life crises might just be your opportunity for growth.
How would you define a quiet life?
A quiet life, for me, involves finding peace with the noise in my head, which is something that I think most of us can relate to, because we all have this monkey chatter. It's about trying to create some distance from that, which mindfulness and then therapy and cognitive reframing ultimately helps us to do.
Sophie, if people are interested and want to connect with you or find out more, where's the best place for them to go?
So the best place would be my website, which is www.sophiescott.co. And there you can find out about booking in with me for a consultation or booking me for a speaking gig. Also do quite a lot of work with founders on their startups, particularly in the health and wellness space. Please do sign up for my newsletter, A 2-Minute Therapist, and keep your eyes peeled for a book that I have coming out in Jan 2025, which is about supporting a loved one with a mental health issue.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sophie, for joining. Wonderful chat, and thank you for all that you shared.
You're so welcome. Thank you for asking me.